Hi, this is Michael Palermo. In our course on CSS3, this module is completely dedicated to something simple, borders. Now the overview is as follows. We're going to understand how we can make them resizable, we're going to see how to round them, and we're going to see how to provide some shadowing to them. This is not a trivial thing because, let's just face it, these are highly sought after features in many of the new and modern websites today. So you're definitely going to want to pay attention to each one of these. Let's start with the first. The resizable capabilities in CSS3 allows us to target a particular element so that we can make it smaller or bigger. Let's see an example of this. We have a class name .box, and we're going to provide some definitions for it. First, we're going to say that it can be resized. When we mention both, we're saying it can be done horizontally and vertically. Of course, the other options would just be either one of those or none. This is very important. If you just do the first one and nothing works, it might be because of this. You must set your overflow to something other than visible. Most elements are visible in the overflow by default. So setting it to auto would allow you, therefore, to take advantage of the resize. What's optional, but a good practice, is to specify your max width and height. Let's say you don't want them to exceed a particular height or width. Likewise, you could also specify a minimum, but keep in mind anything in the box, if there's contents in it, it's already going to some extent, already do that for you. But you could specify a minimum as well. And if you really want to make the user happy, give them a cursor that says, you know what, you can move me. Let's take a look at another very sought out feature. Some might even joke that you can't even have a new modern HTML5 website unless it has a rounded corner in there somewhere. Now, in times past, you may have had to have accomplished this through complex rules and images. Let's take a look now how simple it can be to introduce rounded corners the way you like it in your site. Here we have an example of applying a class name called soft corners. And we're using the border radius property and setting it to 5%. Where this has an advantage in using this approach with the percentage is that whatever we're applying it to, however big it is, we're using a percentage to say, I want it to be a soft corner. The other alternative is to give it a specific size. So in this example, 2em, which would be about the equivalent of 32px. Now that is a fixed size for the corner. And notice these are the two simplest ways that you can add a border radius, and this is going to apply to all corners. Now if I wanted to do the roundup one and be more explicit, then I can use the longer syntax and apply that value to each one of the corners individually. But if you're going to apply the same exact value, you might as well use the simple shortcut as we did in Roundup. I can't wait to show you how cool these things are as we go back to our CSS3 demos website. Now, as we return to our site that we've been building upon from the previous modules, we can see it's starting to come to life. But again, lots of opportunities for us to apply maybe some subtle rounded corners. Let's find a really simple example to start, maybe in our contact area. Maybe I can make some of these things in here rounded. Let's see a simple example of that here by just applying it to an input. Returning to Visual Studio, I'm going to create a definition for that, a rule. So the input is simply going to have a border radius that is going to equal just 1 em. I'm going to save that, return to the browser, and refresh. So now my inputs are rounded. This could be desirable. And as we learned before, I could even go and specifically target certain corners if I really wanted to just have certain corners done. Let's tackle something a little bit more challenging now. I'm going to go over to the topics list. And how about this whole unordered list? Maybe I can make this thing rounded. Let's see what we would have to do to make that work. Returning to Visual Studio, I'm going to create a rule here targeting the topics unordered list, and I want to make sure that it has a border radius. Except I want this one to be 2. I will save that, return to our site, and refresh. Well, I didn't see what I was hoping for. I wonder why. Let's examine this. I'm going to go now into the code, and let's see if we can figure it out. Whenever we're applying a border radius to an element, we do have to be aware of the fact that at times, depending on what the content is inside of that element, it may agree or disagree to be bordered along with it. If it disagrees, as the case we had here, then we may need to target specific areas inside of that element to make sure that it's going to agree. So let me show you what I'm talking about. By adding these rules here, I'm now targeting specific line items. The first one, the fourth one, the ninth one, and the last one. These, of course, represent the various corners now that we have these separated columns in our list. By applying these here and saving this, if I return to the site now and hit refresh, I'll see the rounded corners now appear in those specific areas. Now the question could be asked, did we actually need to have the border radius at the unordered list area, since these seem to have done the job? The answer to that is perhaps not, but in a future feature that we're going to discuss, you're going to see where that's going to be an advantage to keep it that way. So I'll leave it there, and let's look for our next opportunity to have a rounded corner. Let's apply it at a grander scale. How about at the content level? The content is essentially everything on the page. Let me provide a border radius of 2. Save that and view it in the browser. And again, I didn't see the change. For the very same reason I had to do with the unordered list, I'm now going to target specific corners of some of the inner content so that it'll work. I'm going to need to look at the footer, and I'm also going to need to look at the header. So back in Visual Studio, I'm going to add a rule here. I'm going to target the titles ID, which is the top corners of our header section, that they also have a border radius at the top right and top left. I'm going to do the same now for the footer. I also want to make sure to have a slightly rounded effect within the content area with my articles and sections. So I'm going to do another one for articles and sections. I'll refresh. As you can see, we have rounded corners all the way around the content. If I go from the about or the contact, is a good example where we could see a slightly rounded area here where the gradient was applied. Just offered a little softer touch here to our site. Well, we're now going to turn our attention to shadowing. And as mentioned here, this really can, if done correctly, provide depth and perspective to what we display. You can really draw attention to the things you want to. We've already discussed text shadows. Now we're going to see how to apply shadows to elements through box shadows. In this example, the class name downright shady has a box shadow of 4px by 4px by black. Well, what does that mean? Well, the name of the class is the clue. It means down to the right corner, we're going to be offset by 4 pixels down and right, and we're going to use a black color for that. So what if I wanted to go up and left? Well, we have the up and left shady class name that shows how you can use a negative number in those values to go in the reverse. This would give you the ability to go up and left. Shade with the fade introduces a third optional component, and that is the blur. To what extent do I want a blur to appear along with the shadow? We can also introduce the distance. In this example, I call this one glowing because notice that the first two numbers, which reference the offset, they're not going up or down. In fact, they're going nowhere. When you set them to 0, but you also specify a distance, then what you're really saying is go in every direction 5 pixels and have a blur effect of 10 pixels using the color specified. You can get really complex with box shadows. In this example, notice how we have an offset in the very first line for this box shadow of zeros, followed by a blur of 1, a distance of 0.5 em, and then black. So what we're saying is on all sides, we would like to see something black and blurry. But then you can extend it. You could say, in addition to that, in the upper right, I'd like to have a red color. And in the lower right corner, I can say I want to have a blurry looking green color that extends out a little bit. And then in the lower left, I could say, well, I want to have a yellow color, but there will be no blur. And then finally, in the upper left, a blurry looking blue color, but it doesn't extend out any further than the rest of them. Well, I talked a lot about it, but this is what that would look like. This is a screen capture of this exact definition in play. Notice again, the middle square, which is the div that applied this box shadow, it has a black, blurry border, and in addition to that, in the upper right we have our red, lower right we have our green. Notice that the green extends out further because of the distance that was specified. And then we have the yellow in the lower left. Notice how square that one is with no blur, just like the red in the upper right. And then we have the blue in the upper left that does have that blur effect. This gives you an example of the kind of power that you can have using these box shadows. Of course, the best way to see them in action is to do the demos, and we're going to return now to our CSS3 demos website. Now, as you may recall in our site, a question asked earlier in this module was, why did we need to apply the rounded corner, the border radius, to the unordered list when we also had to apply it to specific line items in here to get that rounded effect? Well, the reason for that was I knew I was going to add a shadow to the entire list. And because I'm going to do that, I need the whole list to be rounded as well. If I had just done the list items, then the shadow would appear square, not rounded, not desirable. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio, and this is what I need to do in order to add shadow to the unordered list. That's the topics UL, and I'm going to add a box shadow, and specifically I want 0.5 em, 0.5 em. So I've just established that I want a downright about 8 pixels or half of an em, and I will use a 55, 55, 55 for the color. Let's look at that one first. So I'm going to save that. I'll go back over to the site. Let me go ahead and refresh it. So you can see that a shadow appears. It's nice and crisp. It goes all the way around. Now let's add a blur. For the blur, I just need to go into that next area and just do another 0.5 em. If I now save that, cruise back over to the site and hit refresh, now there's a slight blur going around that unordered list. Let's look at another example where shadowing can be used. How about in our contact area? Whenever we have focus in a given area, let's apply that blur effect to these inputs when they have focus, or anything for that matter that has focus. So what I want to do is I want to say if anything gets the focus, I'm going to apply a glow. That glow can be accomplished with a box shadow. Box shadow. I'm not going to provide any offsets, so 0 space, 0 space, but I do want to have a blur. So 0.25 for my blur. I'm going to do a 0.125 EM. And I forgot the EM over here, so let me add that. So I've established also a distance, and I'm also going to provide a color that is supported, AA5500. So I want that color to appear as a glow around anything that receives the focus. Again, the glow is made possible when I don't specify a specific offset, but I do specify a distance to go in every direction. I'm going to save this, go back over to the site, refresh. Let's see what happens when things get the focus. See how it pops out just a little bit more? That's going to even happen here for our little text area, because the glow or the surrounding area is going to come into play every time something gets focused. Very cool. Now, if I really want to have the content stand out on the page, maybe I can apply a little depth or a little shadowing to the entire content piece. So I'm going to target content, and I would like to provide this complex version of a box shadow. It's using the glow effect. I do have a blur and a distance, and it's going to be gray, but then I'm also specifying some offsets in different directions for the color blue. Let's see how this is going to look when I save this and view it now in the browser. I'll refresh. Now the entire content seems to really be coming alive and coming out of that backdrop with this special glow about it. So in summary, what we learned in this module, we can give the users the ability to resize content. We can also smooth corners and of our choice, and provide shadows, any direction with the color of our choice. I hope you enjoyed this module as much as I did, and that concludes our discussion on borders in CSS3.